when it comes to the Great Lakes, the percentage of movement that's seen right now, what is that like?
Well, I mean, it's very, very significant in terms of volume. There's 40 million residents that live here in the Great Lakes Basin, the majority Americans, but also about 10 million Canadians. The overall capacity in North America is much larger. About 20% of all of North American capacity is here in the Great Lakes Basin. About 80% of it is elsewhere. But nonetheless, it is a very, very significant volume of crude that's moved to the region and refined here, or crude that moves through the region to refining operations primarily east of the Great Lakes Basin.
And when it comes to movement, how does it move?
The large majority, roughly, it's well over 90% of unrefined hydrocarbons or crude gets moved through pipeline. And pipelines are a high capital investment, but a relatively low operating cost method to move unrefined products. So over 90% moved by pipeline, and then a much smaller proportion, roughly 5%, by rail. And then there's very, very small proportion that might be moved by road, by tanker truck, but that's very rare. And then in the Great Lakes themselves, there is no movement on water. So there's no vessels, no ships transporting unrefined or crude hydrocarbon products. There are ships that move limited quantities of refined fuels, including in their own gas tanks, essentially, to power those vessels. There is some crude moved by ship downstream in the St. Lawrence River area, but in the Great Lakes there is no crude moved by water.
So how common is it for a spill or for a whoopsie to happen when it comes to all this movement?
Well, there's sort of two sides to that issue. The first is the likelihood of a spill or a loss of containment. For modern infrastructure that's well maintained, pipeline, rail, etc., the likelihood of a loss of containment is very small. It tends not to happen very often, but the other side of the discussion, the risk discussion, is the severity of impact. Because these are high-volume transport methods, when a spill does occur, there's usually quite severe impact. So risk is sort of a balance of the likelihood of release and the severity of impact. And because, although it's low likelihood, it's high severity, that moves it well up the risk continuum. So, we've seen that with Line 6B in Kalamazoo. We've seen that just outside of the basin in Lac Mégantic in Quebec. So when these events do occur, they are very serious. And so, we need to obviously continue to address it diligently and thoroughly.
Right. When it comes to likelihood, obviously the likelihood would be low if the infrastructure is maintained and updated. What happens if it's not? And how often or how many lines out there fall under that category of not being maintained, or worse, carrying some sort of product that it's not designed for?
Well, I'm not the person to answer that question thoroughly. What I would observe is that in both countries, in the pipeline construction and operation are federally regulated. In Canada, it's the National Energy Board. In the U.S., it's PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Those are highly evolved agencies, with a lot of competent people working with industry to ensure infrastructure is properly designed and built and well operated and maintained. Does the system always work? No. We know that from the events that have happened, but it is a pretty good system, but you've got to continually strive to improve those systems. And, PHMSA or NEB could answer your question better, but those would be my comments.
Okay. So when it comes to the IGC, I know you put up a list in your presentation on some of the things that need to be addressed and some of the things that you guys are working on addressing. Cross-border communication. Can you go over some of those things that will sort of help move us forward toward a situation that makes folks feel a little bit more secure?
Sure, yeah. I mean, first of all, I would just observe that the International Joint Commission, which is not a regulatory agency, we were established through treaty over 100 years ago as an independent commission to advise both federal governments, and we usually have something to say to the states and the provinces as well. We provide science-based advice to those levels of government. We work closely with a number of other organizations across a number of sectors through a number of different partnerships to try to advance this very important issue. So it's complicated, but we do have a small role to play relative to some of that science advice. And so we took a close look at the issue of spills of hydrocarbons, mostly refined products, petroleum, as well as some other chemicals in the Huron-Erie corridor, which is sort of the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, Detroit River area. And that was about 10 years ago. We had a close look at those issues where there were some spills in a short period of time, and we found that in many cases what was required to try to mitigate the likelihood of spills and then the response to those spills is improved coordination between the two countries. And it's coordination of science information, of data warehousing, so there's a single repository to go and get information on spills, their toxicity, and some of the potential impacts. Because of the importance of drinking water intakes along that particular corridor, the importance of having real-time monitoring systems and notification and response systems that can respond very quickly to a spill event so drinking water is not affected, etc. These were some of the coordination issues we've identified. And, in my opinion, the governments have made progress in some of these areas. For example, we have a series of committees around the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that have been struck a few years ago that are improving communication and coordination. We also identified through that effort that spill response could be better coordinated, and so coordination was a really important sort of outcome of our analysis of that effort. A more recent effort, which is ongoing, and it's much more science-based. Our Science Advisory Board is having a close look at the water quality and ecological impacts of spills of crude or unrefined products here in the Great Lakes. And that's been an interesting effort, and although it's still ongoing, so we'll have more to say in due course, perhaps as early as the early part of 2018. But what we're finding there is relative to science information on toxicity and water quality and ecological impacts is that there's much more information on our marine or saltwater systems than freshwater systems here in the lakes. So that's an area that is requiring additional research is around the freshwater environments. We're finding that in some of the groups of species are much better understood in terms of their vulnerability and sensitivity to spills than others. So for example, fish and birds tend to have been studied much more than reptiles and amphibians, some of the smaller critters.
Amphibians on your list.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and these are really important organisms that play an important role in the ecology of the system, but they're not as well understood. We're also finding that where we do have information on toxicity to organisms and impacts on water quality, that it tends to be much more the short-term impacts, the so-called acute impacts, acute toxicity, the toxicity and the response of organisms within minutes or hours or days of a spill event, whereas the chronic or sublethal impacts, the impacts that would occur to organisms that survive the initial spill, but the impacts that would occur over months or years to individuals or populations are less well understood. So we need to get a better handle on that. And so these were some of the sorts of findings that we think are important to fill. And the reason that it's important to have this information is that it allows it to be applied in a number of different ways. For example, good science information around the sensitivity of coastal systems, coastal wetlands to an oil spill, for example, which is something we're looking at, would be helpful information in terms of siting infrastructure. You don't site refineries or pipelines or ports or whatever where there's particularly sensitive habitats. Also, the operation of pipelines and other infrastructure can be influenced by the availability of good science information. And then, very importantly, if there is a loss of containment or a spill, cleanup can be influenced by good science information. Where are those sensitive habitats? Where are those sensitive species? How do we need to consider that information in prioritizing the actions that we do take immediately following a spill? And so, much of the effectiveness of response actions is influenced by the resources and the information that you have right at your fingertips when those spill responders are getting going in the hours after a spill. And so we want to apply the information that way too.